Good morning, everyone, once again. So, respected Professor K.N. Ganesh, Chairperson KCHR, Director Dination V, Research Officer KCHR, Jasira, and Fascia, Academic Coordinator KCHR, and I thank everyone, those who joined here, my colleagues from KCHR and friends and our distinguished speakers. So, a few months ago, we decided to organize a two-day national conference to honor Professor Panikkar because he was about to turn 90 this April. So we decided to have a celebration of his 90 years. So unfortunately, what happened is with his demise, we had to reframe the entire conference into a commemorative conference. So we actually proposed to have a reflection of his contributions in academia as well as his intellectual contributions. And so we have invited scholars from all over India and abroad to contribute to this conference. And I'm very thankful to my dear professors all over from India who gladly agreed to be a part of this event. And I also thank cultural activists who are gathered here who agreed to be part of this event. So I welcome Dr. Jasira CM, Research Officer, KCHR, to give the welcome address.
Distinguished guests, eminent historians, scholars joining us across the globe, and here in person, members of Professor Panikkar's family, his devoted students and friends and colleagues. Good morning. So we gather today with heavy hearts, yet with a shared sense of purpose that I believe Professor K.N. Panikkar would have deeply respected. As Pooja mentioned, this conference was originally conceived as a celebration of a living legacy, a dialogue he himself had blessed and intended to join. Unfortunately, his sudden departure on the 9th March has transformed our gathering into something more quiet and reflective, a space for both critical reflection and heartfelt remembrance. For those of us at this institution, Professor Panikkar was more than a towering intellectual. He was our former chairperson, a guiding light who shaped our vision with his commitment to secularism, democratic values, and decolonization of the Indian mind. He taught us that history is not just a record of the past, but a tool for understanding the struggles of the present. To all our speakers and guests, both here and online, your presence shows how deeply he touched lives across the world. From his seminal work on the culture and ideology of colonial India to his tireless defense of the public intellectual, Professor Panikkar did not just write history, he inspired people to think, to question, and to care. To his family, we thank you for sharing him with us. We hope these 2 days offer a glimpse of how much he was loved and how deeply his ideas have taken root in the hearts of his students and peers. As we begin these sessions, let us not only discuss his bibliography, but also carry forward his spirit, his courage to question, and his rigor in research, and his unwavering belief in a pluralistic India. So it is my privilege to welcome you all. Let this discussion be tribute he truly deserved. To honor a man who viewed history as a living, breathing struggle for culture and ideology, we have organized 7 thematic sessions spread across these 2 days. We begin today with a profound sense of gratitude to Professor K.N. Ganesh, a scholar who shared a long intellectual journey with Professor Panikkar and who has graciously agreed to deliver a keynote address that will set the tone of our deliberations. Over the next 48 hours, we will hear from some of the most luminous minds of our time. We are honored to have with us, either in person or through virtual link, scholars who were his peers, his collaborators, and his students, like Romila Thappar, Prabhat Patnaik, Gopal Guru, and Rajan Gurukul, We will also benefit from the insights of M.V. Narayanan, A.R. Venkadachalapati, G. Arunima, V.J. Varghese, Uday Kumar, J. Deviga, Ravindran Gobinathan, M.A. Baby, K.M. Shiba, P.J. Cherayan, and P.P. Shanavas. So this gathering is not merely a formality, it is a parliament of ideas. It is exactly the kind of gathering Professor Panikkar envisioned when we first spoke to him about this project. He wanted a space where history, politics, and social science could converse without barriers. As we invite Professor K.N. Ganesh for the keynote, I welcome each of you to engage deeply, to debate rigorously, and to remember fondly. I also welcome my colleague, Dr. Fashia, who will deliver vote of thanks to the inaugural session. Now I request Professor K.N. Ganesh to begin the inaugural proceedings. Thank you.
Dear friends and colleagues, as it has been pointed out already, this was originally meant to be a national conference in which some of Professor Panikkar's ideas regarding history, culture, education, and also the history of ideas will be discussed and debated. We actually made an announcement at the beginning that such a conference will be held. We also planned a 1 month celebration. I'm sorry to use the word celebration now. Celebration of the 90th year of Professor Panikkar. And these plans were actually announced by the present Higher Education Minister in a press conference. Now what happened was that immediately after we got down from the conference dais, we were informed that Professor Panikkar had passed away. Now we had to really rethink regarding what we should do. There were suggestions. Some esteemed colleagues of us actually suggested that no, we will do a memorial now and postpone all the deliberations to a later date. But then we thought afterwards that actually Professor Panikkar was not simply a person to be commemorated upon, not an individual, but is actually a person who lived through his times, participated in those, contested what he thought should be contested, stood for certain basic rights which he thought should be defended. So in this sense, all those ideas which he put forward will have to actually be remembered at the same time. So we thought that instead of commemorating a person, we should actually relive a certain group of ideas, a group of what he called as cultural action, what he called also as intervention in education, what he called also as contesting certain ideas that are abhorrent to our times, And he thought that those ideas will have to be contested. If I may quote one of his books, Before the Night Falls. Now that we are seeing the night falling, when we are seeing the night falling, we have to really think about where the light has to be found. And this light could be found, we thought, in the words of Professor Panikkar himself. So, there is a need for us not to just commemorate a person, but also his ideas. As a result, we decided to conduct this conference in a different way. That is, we are not conducting a national conference which is dedicated to Professor Panikkar. But we have invited almost all whom we originally decided to invite for this conference, in order to actually make a memorial, and I would say academic memorial, or I would say the memorial of a social activist. And this has to be done through the people, the persons who actually participated in his life as well as shared his ideas. So as a result, we decided to conduct this meeting. I would say meeting, it is not a conference anymore. I would say meeting. And we are now actually dedicating whatever we are presenting. We have gone through the list of presentations here. Some of them may not be really ideas which Professor Panikkar was engaged in, but we actually decided to dedicate these ideas, because all these ideas which is being presented here correspond to or focus upon the basic interests of Professor Panikkar. In the question of history of ideas and intellectual history, on the points of cultural action, in which he was very much interested in, as well as he actually campaigned all over India, practically, conducting meetings, seminars, workshops. Everywhere in India, he was actually conducting them in order to build up what he called as an agenda for cultural action. A cultural action which will actually build the social consciousness. And this social consciousness is something that we are engaged in at present in this particular memorial. And we think that such a memorial is actually apt in order to commemorate Professor Panikkar. So, we have chosen many of the ideas already. This number of presentations have already been stated. We have chosen all these ideas from probably the last publication of his, History as a Site of Struggle, which is published by 3 essays. And most of these ideas which he chose were coming from this particular last book, primarily not because they are actually papers, they are not research papers, but they are actually presentations, public addresses, or short write-ups and notes, which he wrote in order to actually publicize or record his ideas towards his end. So we have chosen the themes from there, and we have requested a number of scholars to present those themes, and some of them, due to various other engagements, have not been able to be present here, but at the same time, they have expressed their solidarity with us. So we are thankful to all of them. So please consider this as a dedication to Professor Panikkar and not a standard academic conference. So please consider this as that. And this dedication is primarily done in order to relive and probably actually to enhance some of these ideas in future, so that probably we can still find light when the night is falling. So that light, we are looking towards that light, and we are actually using Professor Panikkar's ideas as a beacon to find them. So please consider that as this and nothing more. And also please consider that the whatever discussion or whatever ideas that are presented here should be discussed in future. And probably we will actually find a way past the present nightfall. So thank you very much, and thank you for attending this conference. Thank you.
Good morning all. Respected Chairperson Professor K.N. Ganesh, Director Professor Dination V, dignitaries of the DICE, Research Officer Dr. Jasira Sia, and other dear ones. We have gathered here to commemorate Professor K.N. Panikkar, who was a very dear one to all of us, especially to Kerala Council for Historical Research. As far as we are concerned, Professor Panikkar was a historian, social activist, and educationist who presented our state before the nation. Everyone has talked about his invaluable contributions. In the spirit where history is being rejected, distorted, or maligned, recording history impartially and honestly is indeed a courageous political act. As an unbiased and honest recorder of history, there is no doubt that his contributions will remain as reference for the next generation. For Kerala Council for Historical Research, as the first founder chairperson, Professor K.N. Panikkar was indeed the most important person who spearheaded the establishment of academic activities carried out by KCHR today, or paved such a platform under the government of Kerala. Even though his demise is a loss to all of us, his contributions have been recorded in history for all time and passed on to next generation, shaped or marked in such a way that history remains as history, honestly and impartially. Not speaking at length, I commence on to the task assigned on me. Realizing the importance of this function, we have eminent personalities who have gathered here even among their busy schedule. With extreme joy, I extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to all of them. My thanks are extended to our chairperson, Professor K.N. Ganesh, who enriched the session with his esteemed presence and encouraging words. Thank you, sir. Sincere thanks are extended to Professor Dination V, who lead and encourage us. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Jasira Sia for delivering welcome speech and for organizing this event. My sincere thanks are expressed to all the distinguished scholars who have agreed to be part of this event and contribute their ideas. Thank you everyone who accepted our invitation and gathered here. And last not the least, sincere thanks are extended to our entire KCHR team who put their efforts to bring this event a successful and memorable one. Once again, thank you.
So we have our inaugural lecture today by Professor Romila Thappar. So she told me she's 94 and she cannot travel outside Delhi. And it's very difficult for her to sit online for long to give the lecture. So we pre-recorded her video lecture. So we'll play it.
I first met Professor K in Panikkar.
So I'm really sorry. So we have few people to join online to attend Thappar's lecture. So we'll start it around 10:30. Before that, we'll play a short profile video of Professor K. Panikkar. K. Panikkar, born on April 26, 1936 in Guruvayur, Kerala, emerged as one of the foremost voices in the study of modern Indian history. A Marxist historian of exceptional intellectual rigor, he brought together deep scholarship and a profound public commitment, examining the past through the lenses of social conflict, culture, and ideology. Over the decades, Panikkar made outstanding contributions as a historian, intellectual, cultural activist, and educationist. After teaching at institutions such as the University of Rajasthan and the Indian Institute of Public Administration, he joined Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1972. There he served as a professor of history and later held key academic positions including head of the Center for Historical Studies and dean of the School of Social Sciences. From 1990 to 1997, he served as the president of Janasamskriti, Delhi. He was also closely associated with Sahmat Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, reflecting his deep engagement with progressive cultural movements and his commitment to defending secular and democratic values in the public sphere. His intellectual work was closely intertwined with his political engagements, particularly in resisting communalism and advocating for a critical, people-oriented understanding of history. He served as Vice Chancellor of Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit in Kaladi and later as Vice Chairperson of the Kerala State Higher Education Council. He was the founding chairperson of Kerala Council for Historical Research from 2001 to 2007. In 2008, he was elected president of the Indian History Congress, the country's largest association of professional historians. He also served as the founding president of the Kerala History Congress. He has written extensively on the cultural and intellectual history of colonial India. His publications include British Diplomacy in North India, Against Lord and State, Religion and Peasant Uprising in Malabar, Culture and Consciousness in Modern India, National and Left Movements in India, and Communalism in India, History, Politics, and Culture. He also compiled two source volumes, Peasant protest and revolts in Malabar and towards freedom. 1940, a documentary history of the freedom struggle. Professor Panikkar was a strong opponent of historical distortion. He remained a significant figure in discussions about education, secularism, and cultural politics. His work highlighted the experiences of marginalized communities and maintained that history should serve as a site for critical inquiry and social change. For all of us at KCHR, this loss is very personal. Professor Panikkar was not only a founding figure of the institution, but also a guiding presence. His intellectual clarity, moral conviction, and quiet strength will be fondly remembered. His passing marks the end of an extraordinary life. However, his ideas, commitments, and example will continue to influence the study of history and public life for generations to come. We have exhibited a few selected works of K.N. Panikkar here, so you can have a look at it. And we also have a small photo album where it's from KCHR archives, workshop photographs and Pattanam excavation photographs and all. You can have a look at it. And now I think we can start the inaugural lecture by Professor Romila Thappar.
I first met Professor K.N. Panikkar when I joined Delhi University. I joined Delhi University in 1963 and taught courses on ancient Indian history. It was a small department in those days, staffed by historians who preferred to stay with the history that they had learnt at the university. The more enterprising historians interested in the changes that history as a discipline was undergoing were the ones who were teaching in the colleges affiliated to the university. Talking to them about history was indeed a pleasure. Slowly, a group of us began to gather and hold discussions informally about historical subjects. The more vocal among them was Professor Bipin Chandra, who was enthusiastic about the changes that were taking place in historical studies. But among those who grappled with the changes and wrote and taught the more creative new history was Professor K.N. Panikkar, universally known and more affectionately as KN. In the early 1970s, a few of us joined the JNU and established the Center for Historical Studies, with specialists working in various periods of Indian history. There were many issues that demanded discussion, since our courses were of a kind not taught in most other universities. We were less concerned with covering broad swathes of history and instead focused more on taking up themes that raised questions and concentrated on how historians answer such questions. Initially, one's specialization was not so crucial, and what mattered were the questions one raised that had historical relevance. This is when I really got to know KN better and appreciated his understanding of history. I learned much from this, as indeed I did from a few others who also came up with worthwhile questions and possible answers. I much appreciated having KN as a colleague. After some months of daily brainstorming and intense discussion, we did finalize really relevant courses that were rather different from the usual ones taught in other universities. We were told by other historians outside JNU that these courses would make students unhappy as they were too new and therefore rather difficult. But after the first year of teaching, when we asked students if they found the courses too difficult, they replied that on the contrary, the fact that these courses were giving in-depth replies to historical questions forced them to think, and that this was a new and welcome process. It was so different from just learning facts by rote and reproducing them. For many of us who were teaching, it implied a more extensive reading of various histories and the pursuance of what came to be called the historical method. All of us in the CHS had varied specializations, and discussions amongst us became very rich. This was also what made us know our colleagues and their intellectual concerns, and many casual conversations encouraged warm friendships. This was when I came to know KN and to appreciate his approach to history. Over the years, he was a person I often turned to for clarifications in the history of modern India. What then was the historical method which we did not refer to formally, but slowly got used to applying in our research? We worked out a course on what we called historical method, and this was not a course taught in any other university in India. It also involved introducing some notions of what we call historiography, the history of how history is written from different perspectives from time to time, and what was the contribution of historians. Historiography is a significant way of observing how contemporary times look back to the past. Since historiography has few time boundaries, there was much discussion between all of us researching and teaching various periods of history. KN and I were often in conversation when I needed to get a perspective on the modern take of the early past. His focus was mainly on culture and nationalism, and later on culture and communalism. The history of India, as we have learnt it in the past century, was written initially by colonial writers. When they inquired about ancient histories from the Indian past, using the ancient Greco-Roman and Chinese histories as exemplars, they were told that there were none in India. They assumed, therefore, that a sense of history was absent in Indian civilization, and that this absence required that they should discover and construct that history. The colonial histories that were written were inevitably based on the 18th century understanding of India. In the history so constructed, India conformed to the theory of Oriental despotism as applied to pre-colonial Asian states. Some translations were made of Persian writing on Indian history in the late 2nd millennium AD, but colonial scholars preferred colonial interpretations of the Indian past. These were written to suit the colonial perspective, but were not free from errors. Oriental despotism was a European concept that was said to characterize the societies of Asia among which India was a prime example. Certain incontrovertible features were essential to this history. There was an absence of the state, since the functions of the state were unnecessary with a despot wielding absolute power. That despot was maintained by peasants who paid rent and taxes in kind, money, and labor. The despot's power was further ensured by his controlling, through a bureaucracy, the irrigation system so essential to cultivation in Asia, where the land was believed to be largely arid. The bureaucracy helped collect the taxes that provided much of the despot's wealth. All land was the property of the despot, thus making it impossible for individuals to own land as private property. The despot was sovereign over a subservient, poverty-stricken population that labored for him. It was a society that lacked freedom and was static in every way. Given this, there was no requirement for recording past events. Therefore, a sense of history, it was argued, was also absent in such societies, which came to be regarded as culturally and otherwise to inferior when compared to the societies of Europe. This was the colonial understanding of the Indian past. It was not questioned until the 20th century. Parallel to this was another form of getting information on the past, which had results that led to reasonably reliable ideas in the long run. In the late 18th century, William Jones began to read the Vedic texts, and ideas began to be formulated about the Indo-Aryan languages and its speakers. Comparisons were made with Iranian Aryan and the Celtic languages. At the same time, archaeology was introduced as a parallel source of information. A major breakthrough occurred with the decipherment of the Brahmi script a few decades later, which led to the reading of inscriptions. These inscriptions were an excellent source of early history. But scripts change over time. The Brahmi of the Ashokan edicts could not be read in modern times. So, the decipherment of Brahmi was a major help in reconstructing the past. It also provided an alternative reading of the past that was not identical with the reading that came from Sanskrit texts. These laudable efforts laid the foundations for the study of ancient history. They provided evidence for a more systematic study of historical events and narrated in dated chronological order. The narrative of history was being slowly put together. It was this colonial history that was viewed as the authentic history, and this continued until it was challenged by historians writing in the mid-20th century. Two writers of the 19th century were highly influential in their colonial versions of Indian history. James Mill, with his The History of British India, published in 1817 and onwards, and Frederick Max Muller, with his readings of the Vedas and what he called the Aryan race. Neither of them visited India, although invited to do so more than once, nor did they consult with Indian scholars. Yet, their readings of Indian history were accepted, and their very firm ideas soon became imprinted on the minds of the British and later of Indians. Historical debates on these writings occurred later. Mill's theory was that the Indian identity and activity came from two religious groups, Hindu and Muslim. He defined them as nations, which was incorrect as they were religions and not nations. The two should not be confused. He claimed that they were permanently hostile to each other. The implication of this was that British rule was necessary to keep the peace between the two and to protect the Hindus from being victimized by the Muslims. The Muslim community was more easily defined since it was an Abrahamic religion, singular, monotheistic, and unified, and therefore similar to Christianity. Hinduism posed a problem with its obvious flexibility in the form of multiple sects that was crucial to its organization. But what was considered rather alien by many, as it did not conform to the pattern of the Abrahamic religions. Colonial scholarship tried to impose a monotheistic imprint on Hinduism, which was partially responsible for some confusion in comprehending the religion. Not having been founded by a historical person, its origins were traced to a people, the Aryans. William Jones maintained that Indo-Aryan, the language of the Vedas, had some similarities with ancient Greek, a point hinted at by earlier European writers as well. Max Muller's contribution suggested that the Aryans were a superior race from Central Asia, and that their religion, as formulated in the Vedas, was the foundation of Hinduism. The territory where they settled became the homeland of both people and religion, the Hindus and Hinduism. In the absence of archaeological and linguistic data at that time, it was argued that there were no other people of any consequence in the areas where the Aryans settled. These two theories of Mill and Muller took deep root and became foundational to views about India. Mill's theory became the foundation of the two-nation theory, a theory that continues to be foundational to the ideology of Hindutva and the political parties that support it. The creation of Pakistan catered to Muslim ambitions. The creation of the Hindu Rashtra, Hindu nation, towards which India is sought to be taken these days, is endorsed by some Hindu ambition, as well as claims that it represents the future desired by the majority community. A further claim is that the Muslims, apart from constantly asserting themselves as alien invaders, also continually victimized the Hindus. The groups of Muslims from West and Central Asia also came as migrants from the late 1st to the 2nd millennium AD and settled permanently in northern and western India. That is of no consequence to this argument. That is one reason why migrant communities that came and settled in India and became part of the fabric of the Indian population need to be researched far more deeply by historians. Max Muller is associated with ideas that gave rise to the theory of Aryan race, impressed as he already was with racial theories and race science, as it was called, current in Europe at the time. Aryan origins supported the theory that it was a superior race, and Indo-Aryan, being part of the Indo-European family of languages, was seen as a link to connections with Europe, thus giving its speakers a superior status, as was the belief in Europe at that time. Yet, despite race no longer being regarded as an acceptable identity, its use persists in some explanations. The Hindutva ideology, formulated in 1925, was based on these colonial constructions of the Indian past. It was projected as the sole viable interpretation of early Indian history and the true and indigenous view of the ancient Indians. Although its origin and formulation is factually based in the colonial history of India, this is not alluded to. Yet, it conforms to the two-nation theory of James Mill. Curiously, little is said about the Iranian Aryans closely related to the Indo-Aryans, their language being a cognate of Indo-Aryan. A more strongly stated perspective was added to these theories by the writings of Thomas Macaulay in the early 19th century, which influenced more than just the construction of history. He was dismissive of early Indian texts. European and Asian societies were contrasted in some European thought. Asian societies were said to have their own pattern, with institutions that did not resemble those of Europe, since Asian history was based on Oriental despotism. This model provided what was thought to be the possible explanation for various absences in Asian societies. Theories were put forward by George Frederick Hegel, the philosopher, and Karl Marx on the absence of a state and the prevalence of despotic rule. Marx famously postulated the Asiatic mode of production to explain Asian history, which Marxists today have quite rightly discarded. However, it was followed closely in Europe in the popular writing of Karl Wittfogel. In the later 20th century, Indian and European historians began to show that this description was quite untenable and inapplicable to Asian societies. The 20th century witnessed critical analyses being applied to various societies by social theorists, including Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, Etienne Balibar, and others. Their theories explaining European and Asian societies, even where they were not adopted, were catalysts in exploring the functioning of societies and other theories. The critical analyses made of European society were entirely different from the assumptions and questions as applied to Asia. Marx's theory on the patterns of historical change in Europe had no hint of the Asiatic mode of production that was applied only to Asian societies. In the European pattern, historical change moved from an initial primitive communism to what Marx called the slave mode of production. European societies were then said to have changed gradually to the feudal mode of production controlled by a feudal elite using the income generated by the labor of serfs. Subsequent to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the feudal mode gave way to the capitalist mode, during which the inequality was largely between the owners of industry and those who worked the machines. The anticipated future in Europe was that the inequality would end and a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources would create a society based on equal rights. These theories were a response to recognizing that there was a change in society over a period of time, and that the patterns of change had to be studied and established. The question then was, what was the pattern of change and why did it occur? It was recognized that the history of Europe underwent changing modes. But in India, society was said to be static, or else followed the two-nation theory. A few historians did try and search for patterns of change in Asian history, which led to new ways of investigating the region's history. What resulted from these investigations was a turn to what we now call the historical method. This involved three aspects of historical research. One was the insistence that historical analysis must be based on proven and reliable data. The veracity of sources became a major concern. Every historical generalization had to prove that the evidence it was based on was reliable. Secondly, the connections that were being made between examining data for what caused an event or how it happened had to be of a logical and rational kind. Wishful thinking or fantasy was not acceptable. Thirdly, when speaking of events happening in the past, it was necessary to investigate the how and the why of an event. How did an event happen and why did it happen? This led to a deeper understanding of the event and therefore a better explanation. To do this, there was a combination of the historian's analysis of sources and also to see if the patterns suggested by those putting forward theories of explanation, such as Karl Marx or Max Weber, or more recently Hayden White and Michel Foucault, could be used to get a better understanding of the society under study. For example, Marx describes feudalism in Europe as conforming to a particular pattern. One may ask whether this pattern also applied to Indian history in the late first and early second millennium CE, or did Foucault's ideas on the interaction of knowledge and power hold true for the role of the Brahman in Indian history? There is nothing frightening or inherently dubious about applying the Marxist or Weberian or any other pattern to understanding a society. These are all ways of trying out more effective investigations of a society by attempting explanations of possible social functioning to see which, if any, applied. The effort is to explain how a society functioned, and that can be attempted from various perspectives and in manifold ways. This need not be confined to explaining the Indian past only by applying the two-nation theory, which gave rise to communal history, or the theory of Aryan race. In assessing whether any of these modes applied to Indian history, only two had possibilities, the feudal and the capitalist. The first became subject of an intense debate in around the 1980s and 90s, and the second, linked to colonialism, initially raised less of a debate, but since then the analysis of colonialism has led to a wider range of arguments. This in itself suggested fresh questions that had to be asked of the sources. Questions always lead to further questions. It has been intellectually exciting to test explanations, as this has opened up new perceptions in understanding the past and new explanations. Let me go back to 1947 and after, when changes in understanding history were being advanced. My generation was imbued with the larger imprint of anti-colonial nationalism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of anti-colonial nationalism. As happens everywhere, nationalism and history grew closely intertwined. Or, as Eric Hobsbawm puts it, what history is to nationalism can be compared with what the poppy is to heroin addiction. Some of the Indian professional historians set aside the earlier colonial theories explaining India. If any aspect of any theory was at all acceptable, it was still to be verified through the evidence available. What was so helpful was to be able to discuss the nuances of nationalism with a historian like Cain, who had made such a deep study of the subject, particularly to assess the varieties of nationalism that went into the making of what was emerging. There was gradually the separation of secular anti-colonial nationalism and the religious nationalism that was slowly drawing strength from the partition of 1947. The history that succeeded as national history was important and much researched. But creeping alongside of this, nurtured by the two-nation theory, was religious nationalism. The mobilization of the Hindu and Muslim communities with the religion of the community being the primary identity and distinct from the larger secular nationalism slowly took form. The end purpose was not of creating one unified Indian state, but two separate states based on religious majorities. The communal interpretation of history was popularized so as to give legitimacy to communal history. There was a difference in the two types of nationalism. Anti-colonial nationalism included all the people of the potential nation, having equal status and equal rights. This was ensured by making democracy and secularism as among its foundations as a nation. Qualified nationalism, be it qualified by religious, linguistic, ethnic, or any other forms, is different. It does not include all the people, but only refers itself to the majority, whether it be that of the dominant religion or some other majority community, which majority supposedly gives an identity to the nation. To enforce this, the nationalism defined by a label strengthens its base by locating a minority community which is then treated as the scapegoat. An example of this is Germany in the 1930s, when the Nazi ideology referred itself to the large Aryan Teutonic race and made the Jewish race the scapegoat. In India, the initial anti-colonial nationalism succeeded in liberating the Indian people from colonial control and established a democratic secular nation in 1947. But a concession had to be made to one of the two religious nationalisms, the Muslim, that succeeded in establishing a religious state, Pakistan, and the Hindu is waiting to establish a Hindu Rashtra. James Mill's two-nation theory was quickly picked up by the Indian middle class. It became foundational to what evolved into a communal interpretation of Indian history, with historical actions being explained as caused by religious requirement. The medieval past in particular was seen more frequently only in terms of these two religious identities interacting, and their supposed constant confrontations. This was despite the writings of many historians who put forward arguments that referred to activities and relationships that were not religious yet had considerable consequence, and also conveniently forgetting that religious confrontations go back to pre-Islamic history and were then between Brahmins and Shramans. In these studies, it was not the entire Indian middle class that picked up the two-nation theory, only some sections of it. There was also another section of the middle class that was strongly opposed to this. In the years after 1947, we were reading and researching a secular history of India, moving away from the colonial two-nation theory. The discipline of history was undergoing significant changes, moving from Indology to becoming a social science. The major innovations in history that characterized this change were two. One was that history had now to view events in a wider context, and the historical view was no longer confined to political and diplomatic history. Kings, battles, and conquests was what history consisted of earlier. It now had to include studying the social and economic background of an event as linked to possible causes. The second development was that describing subjects studied by the term disciplines, as the social sciences were now described, the historical discipline, the sociological discipline, and so on, meant that their research was not casual, but had to follow a procedure and a method of investigation. This is a very important change. It had to be disciplined. What we now call the historical method of investigation had its beginnings at this time. Inevitably, in using this method and seeking to investigate the entire society, social and economic history came into importance, not just in India, but elsewhere in the world as well. This meant some fundamental changes, including a widening of the perspective of history, which introduced more sources and of various kinds other than just texts. Inevitably, this led to a vast number of new questions based on new insights into how societies function. This interdisciplinary exploration was required to explain the forms taken by society at various times and by the institutions that had helped shape that society over time. Social groups, whether they be clans, castes, communities, or classes, when they become prominent, they seek their own histories or want them written with the appropriate claims. Some aspects of society, earlier regarded as marginal, began to be explored more thoroughly. As a result, new themes in historical research prevailed. These were investigations that emerged half a century ago, and the ensuing research highlights aspects of society that had been overlooked until then. Histories of various social categories of women, for instance, which had been ignored previously, are being researched and written from the perspective of gender, asking searching questions about facets of women's lives in early times. Studies of the Avarna sections, the lower half of Varna society, who were not always even given a caste identity, as they were regarded as too low and outside caste, are also now being studied from a historical perspective. Even where some research existed, low castes, untouchables, and women were relatively undifferentiated. For the longest time, these groups were relegated to the edges of social history. Current studies foreground identities within such groups, as well as their social role. Broader questions also surfaced. Some superseded the colonial theories and focused on the why and the how of historical change, and did so in some depth. Some answers were closely linked to theories of explanation that demanded larger perspectives. However, the history acceptable to Hindutva, now given official patronage through the state controlling textbooks in school and curriculum in universities, has reinstated the outdated colonial theories discarded by professional historians. The difference between the earlier ways of researching history and the new methods and questions can be a small problem. It is not so easy to control the exploration of new questions in historical research. The questions range widely so as to provide a better understanding of the sources and their contexts. This requires a deep study of the purpose of a text, or what we would call its agency. Ultimately, the audience for which a text is written would also be a consideration in comprehending some of what is written. It is politically shrewd, therefore, by many in power today to dismiss the newer methods and the introduction of socio-economic history as being leftist or Marxist. However, one may well ask that since the idea of modes of production is one among many theories of explanation, why should it be dismissed at all? There is a confusion in this attitude between recognizing Marxism as providing a theory explaining history and society, and the use of Marxism as a political ideology to organize revolution. Any theory of explanation with reference to history has a procedure of investigation and a pattern of analysis. It is these that have to be assessed. This has not been recognized by most non-Marxists, except by the very few who have read Marxism and know the theory. It was not an abstract theory. We, in our time, were emphasizing social and economic history in formulating the context of historical events, and the context is very important in the understanding of an event. We were assessing new methods and introducing fresh perceptions. But some have accused us of surreptitiously introducing Marxist ideas by bringing in socio-economic history. Yet, there was nothing surreptitious in what we were doing, and socio-economic history, in any case, is not confined to a Marxist analysis alone. The sociologists Max Weber and Louis Dumont were also analyzing religion and society in India using their own theory of explanation, which was not Marxist. There was, therefore, a search for new sources, and it is amazing how much new material was gathered through consulting other disciplines in the form of interdisciplinary research. Archaeology comes to mind with the discovery of material remains from the past through excavation. Archaeology provides history with a reality that gives a new dimension to an abstract historical fact gleaned from a text. Archaeology has encouraged the exploration of the past from directions that are new, such as the study of the landscape and ecology. And more recently, genetics is another discipline that has come into the study of the past, and it draws on biological aspects. All this involves a large input of interdisciplinary studies. Treating history as a social science has made interdisciplinary studies more approachable. The influence of this is perhaps seen most effectively in the application of linguistics to early texts. This is the kind of analysis of the language of the sources that may reveal the degree to which a particular language reflects the use of other languages, elements of which are sometimes found in the main language. And this may in turn suggest a close contact between the speakers of two different languages. This is an indication that also provides clues to the study of migrations and settlers. The other substantial contribution to interdisciplinary research has been that historians who read the essentials of sociology, social anthropology, or economic history, or the history of religion, are familiar with the questions that are posed by scholars in these disciplines. Some of these questions are also relevant to the reconstruction of the past, as they tend to help historians to formulate questions that probe the sources even more deeply. These changes in the discipline of history have been happening since the mid-20th century. Historians today have to understand them so that they can benefit from them when making historical analyses. These were some of the ideas that we discussed with our research students. Knowledge is not static, nor is the understanding of history. All existing knowledge has to be analyzed and, if need be, questioned, for that is the only way in which knowledge advances. The questions have to be relevant for the data to be used for this purpose. The advancement of knowledge is what education is all about. And in all this, Cain made a significant and rock-solid contribution. We regarded ourselves in the CHS as very fortunate that we had him as a colleague and as one who was always ready to discuss these ideas and advance historical knowledge. Thank you.
On behalf of KCHR, I thank Professor Romila Thappar. So there is a slight change in today's schedule. So I'll just read it out. So we'll start with the first session, History as a Site of Struggle by Prabhat Patnaik. Session 2, Education, Education for Democracy, Professor Panikkar's contributions by Professor M.V. Narayanan. Make Dictators, Professionalization of Tamil Teachers in Colonial India by Professor A.R. Venkatajalapati. And after the lunch break, we'll start with the session History, Thinking with Images, Artists, Concepts and Histories in Contemporary India by Professor G. Arunima. Second session by Religion and the Secular, Malabar Migrations, Anti-Eviction Mobilization and the Question of Emplacement by Professor Vijay Varghese. Next is an online session by Professor Gopinath Revindran, K.N. Panikkar's contribution to the study of agrarian change and struggles in Malabar. After that, we have the fourth session, Conceptualizing Culture, K.N. Panikkar's Ideas on Activism by P.P. Shanavas. And in the open session, we will have P.J. Cherian, who will be speaking about the contributions of K.N. Panikkar. Thank you. Now we'll take a break for tea, and you can have a look at the exhibitions that is over there. Thank you. And please be back by 11:40.